Today, we become legends.
So you're looking to get into Conquest in Season 8 Smite? Well, look no further. This guide will cover everything you need to know from the absolute basics to advanced strategies and everything in between. No matter if you're a beginner or have been playing Smite for years, this guide will cover everything you need to know. But before we start, it would be wonderful if you could take just a moment of your time to lightly tap the like button if you appreciate my hard work. These full feature-length guides take dozens of hours in total to put together, from initial scripting to recording, background gameplay, editing, and all the other small things that go into them. So if you do benefit from this guide, then be sure to share it around with anyone you think needs this information for Season 8. But with that said, let's kick this off with the contents of the guide. I'll have timestamps on screen, in the pinned comment down below, and on the timeline bar of the video for you to skip around to where you feel you need to learn, or you can simply sit back and enjoy the whole thing through. So first up, the absolute basics. This will cover what Conquest is and why you might want to play it. If you played Smite before, you may want to skip this section. Second, we'll cover the 5 roles of Conquest. These will be brief introductions and not complete guides. If you're looking for in-depth guides on all of the roles in Conquest, then be sure to subscribe because I will be doing in-depth individual role guides coming soon. Next, the jungle layout, an important part of Conquest that every player should know, jungler or not. Then the objectives of Conquest, what they're all about and how to play around them. Followed by the game phases section. Conquest has very distinct game phases compared to other modes or games, and it's critical to know how to play in each phase and how they differ from each other. And finally, I'll cover a bunch of smaller minor topics to finish off the video, such as rotations, invading, ganks, warding, and others. Alright, so with that done, let's get started. Conquest is Smite's premier game mode and is designed with a competitive edge in mind. It is by far the most in-depth mode with plenty to learn about, though if you've searched up a guide, you probably know this already. Conquest takes place on a large map with 3 lanes and a jungle area in between. How you win in this mode is by destroying towers, phoenixes, and gaining control of the map to ultimately access the enemy base and defeat their titan. Conquest has been around a good while, and the core 5 roles of Conquest have become well established. The structure of a Conquest team needs to cover all 3 lanes and the jungle area effectively. That's where these roles come from. The mid laner in Conquest presides over the mid lane. Yes, I know, this is why you looked up a Conquest guide, I'm sure. And is primarily an AoE burst damage dealer for the team. Usually a mage, but some hunters see reliable play here also. They will typically farm the minions in mid lane as well as the local jungle camps occasionally. They will typically make rotations and plays around the jungler and support in the early to mid game, which forms the core trio of Conquest. The mid lane in Smite is somewhat of a hub that players congregate around and fight over due to its central location in the map. As the mid laner, you are the guardian of that central location, so it's a very important role. The solo laner resides in the solo lane, which is on the fire giant side of the map. Do not fall into the habit of calling it right or left lane, as this changes depending on if you are order or chaos side. Order side solo lane is right lane, but chaos side solo lane is left lane. I only stress this because I see a lot of new players falling into this trap that really doesn't help them improve at all, so keep that in mind. Solo laners in Conquest are all about the 1v1 and are typically frontline tanks, usually warriors and guardians, though solo lane has the most diverse roster in the game and many different gods can work here. They will play in isolation for a good portion of the game, fighting their lane opponent in the 1v1, protecting their lane and securing farm for both them and their team. They will then rotate into fights sometime after the 10 or 15 minute mark and start wreaking havoc with the XP and gold lead they have gained from being 1v1 for most of the game. Moving to the Gold Fury side of the map, once again, don't call it left or right lane, it's Gold Fury side, purple buff side, duo lane side, or long lane side due to the towers being further apart than in solo lane, hence the lane is effectively longer. Here resides the ADC, who, similar to the solo lane, is largely focused around the 1v1 laning phase for a good portion of the early game. However, unlike solo laners, the ADC is typically a ranged hard carry damage dealer, usually a hunter, though some mages can see play in ADC also. The ADC typically leans towards that late game glass cannon carry playstyle that you will know is for you. However, the ADC is not alone here, at least not for the early game anyway. The support also resides here for the early game, making this a duo lane, as opposed to the solo lane we covered earlier. That's where these names come from. The support in Smite is probably what you guessed it would be. A player that helps teammates stay alive and do their thing by crowd controlling enemies, peeling allies to keep them safe, and providing strong buffs to teammates. Typically, tanks see play here, such as guardians and some warriors, but a few non-tanks can see play in support also. Supports will spend the early game laning phase with their ADC to keep them safe, as the ADC is quite weak early on and lacks good clear, but after the 5 to 8 minutes or so, the support should start rotating towards mid and roaming to provide assistance where they are needed the most, and leaving the ADC to do their thing in the 1v1 laning phase. So that's all 3 lanes covered with 4 of 5 players assigned. The remaining player is of course the jungler. A very unique role with a playstyle unlike any any laning role, the jungler in Smite is the most demanding role and requires more knowledge of the game than other roles typically. So if you're just starting out, I would recommend learning one or two of the laning roles for a little while before jumping into the jungle. The jungler will, of course, roam the jungle areas between the lanes while looking for opportunities to attack enemy laners and get their own lanes ahead. Where lane roles get consistent farm from the minion waves every 30 seconds, junglers get farm from their jungle camps scattered around the map. There's no shortage of these, which allows the jungler to never have to linger in any one lane, but roam around and show up where they're needed when opportunities present themselves. So those are the 5 core roles of Conquest, but on the topic of junglers, let's cover the jungle layout of Conquest. Between the lanes, we have 2 primary jungle areas that are symmetrical in the horizontal axis, meaning where there is a camp in your half of the jungle, there is the same camp in the enemy half of the jungle in the same location. This effectively splits the jungle into 4 quadrants, but you only really need to learn 2 of them since it's mirrored. Every role must know the jungle layout as it comes into play in a major way in the mid to late game. Don't think that just because you're not the jungler, you don't need to learn the jungle. It's precisely the opposite. In the duo lane side jungle, we find the red buff taken by the mid laner, which gives increased power, the purple buff over by duo lane taken by the ADC, which gives attack speed and a protection reduction aura. You have a set of back harpy camps which just give XP and gold with no additional effect. Then 3 camps in a neutral contestable position that you fight over with the enemy team. These are the alpha harpies of duo lane and the duo side mid camps, which both just give XP and gold like the back harpies do. Then the oracles, which are tankier than normal harpies but give a vision area around the gold fury when killed. Useful for keeping tabs on enemy movements and checking if they're taking gold fury. The solo lane side of the jungle is a similar story, but not exactly the same. The speed buff resides at the back of the solo side jungle and gives movement speed. This goes to the jungler so they can roam more effectively through the jungle and chase down enemies on ganks. The blue buff is the other buff on solo side and gives mana regen and cooldown reduction. This one goes to the solo laner to help them stay in lane longer for those 1v1s. There are 2 back harpy camps on this side as opposed to the one on duo side, but they serve the same purpose, as do the solo side mid harpies, which are located here. The Totem of Ku is just next to solo lane, which is a neutral objective that is passive. It won't attack you back, but once you pump in the required amount of damage before your opponent does the same, you can claim the totem for your team, which gives team-wide gold and a buff to your tower radiuses that gives mana regen while stood in range. And the final thing of note in the jungle are the scorpions. There are lesser scorpions on the sides of duo and solo lane, so not technically in the jungle, but I count them in this section. Duo has 1 for each team, while solo has 1 that is fought over. The scorpions provide extra farm, add a healing aura for a short time to the killer, and have a unique 3 basic attack secure system. The greater scorpions use the same secure system but are much harder to kill and are located in the jungle. The first of these scorpions are located in the Gold Fury and Fire Giant pits, a neutral location. However, when you take one of these greater scorpions, its next spawn will be inside the enemy's jungle, and if they take it, its next spawn will be in your jungle. Taking these scorpions will enhance the 2 jungle buffs on that side of the map, so taking Gold Fury side scorpion enhances red and purple, taking Fire Giant side scorpion enhances speed and blue. So that's the jungle, but there are 3 things left to cover in regards to the Conquest map, the objectives of Conquest. Conquest is often defined by its teamfighting and objective play. If you're coming from other game modes, this is something you need to drill into your very being. Objectives are everything. If you wipe the enemy team but then just go back to farming, you don't really gain any progress towards winning the game, but if you wipe the enemy team and get a Fire Giant from that, well, you're in great shape to win. The Gold Fury is likely the first objective you'll be looking at taking in Conquest. This is located on the duo lane side of the map, and you've likely heard me reference it throughout this video already. The Gold Fury is a strong monster that requires a coordinated effort to take down. You usually won't be soloing this and will often have 3, 4 or even 5 people fighting for control of this objective. On killing it, your entire team gets a large amount of gold and some additional XP. Beyond just farming better and of course getting kills, the Gold Fury is a large part of how you get a lead on the enemy throughout the game. The Gold Fury has 3 variants, the standard Gold Fury, which is what we just discussed, but also the Primal Fury, which gives you a permanent damage increase to future objectives and jungle camps, and the Oni Fury that powers up your next minion wave in each lane to help you push. The first Fury of the game is always a standard Gold Fury, but after that it will be a random one which comes next, but not allowing the same one twice in a row. The Pyromancer on the Fire Giant side of the map is similar to the Gold Fury, but often requires a less concerted effort to take down, but provides generally lesser rewards. You'll still get a decent chunk of golden XP for the entire team, plus a substantial movement speed buff as you leave the base, allowing you and your team to recall more freely as you can return to your lanes or the jungle faster. so don't disregard this objective. But finally, we have the big boy of Conquest, the Fire Giants. This of course gives a hefty chunk of golden XP to the entire team, as with the other objectives, but this also provides an extremely powerful and game-changing buff to your damage, regeneration, and structure damage. At 30 minutes into the game, the enhanced Fire Giant replaces the normal Fire Giant, being harder to kill but providing an enhanced version of the buff. The Fire Giant is not to be taken lightly and will almost always require 3 or more people, usually a full team, to take down, and you will likely see heavy resistance if you attempt to take it from the enemy team. Likewise, you should contest this if at all possible when the enemy are trying to take it. Giving up this objective is usually not something you want to do. You can take this in an open 5v5, but usually you will look to take Fire Giant if you pick off an enemy or two and have the advantage in a fight. This way, if the enemy does try to contest your push, you can turn the fight on them and wipe the whole team instead. On that topic, Fire Giant is also a good choice after a team wipe if you feel you can't straight up end the game after it. So let's move on to the game phases of Conquest. This is a really important section as Conquest has very distinct phases of the game and you have to play differently in each one. A typical Conquest game will be divided into 3 game phases: early game, mid game, and late game. The early game is roughly the first 10 minutes, the mid game is roughly 10 to 20 minutes, and the late game is roughly 20 minutes plus. But each game will vary drastically depending on the gods and players in the current game, so these are just rough guidelines, not absolute rules. The early game of Conquest is dominated by farming and small skirmish fights. Most roles will be laning for the early game, trying to get a lead on their lane opponent by implementing effective farming techniques and taking fights. The jungler will be doing the same, but in the jungle and looking for ganks when opportunities present themselves. This is a slow ramp up to the later stages of the game and will usually not completely decide the match, but one team can get a modest lead here and have the advantage going into the mid game. The mid game is typically when teams will start to group up and laning roles will rotate more and look towards objectives. The Gold Fury is very much in play in the mid game and will often be the primary focus of team fights and a lot of the play throughout the 10 to 20 minute mark, as teams look to take the lead and run with it. Small scale team fights will undoubtedly break out over these objectives or just as your team crosses paths with the enemy team, and the victors of these skirmish fights will have the advantage going into the late game. The late game is when the huge 5v5 team fights that Conquest is known for will be happening all the time. Fire Giant becomes the primary focus in the late game in terms of objectives, as the team that can take it will often gain a huge advantage and control of the map. Other objectives are still in play though, especially the Oni and Primal Fury benefits can still be very relevant even into the late game. It's just that the Fire Giant will steal the show for the most part. The late game can pretty much be summarized in 2 words: group up. You'll be wanting to fight with your whole team's strength to win the upper hand in this phase of the game. The winners of the mid game will have an advantage coming in with item and XP leads, but the game is definitely not decided until the late game. If your team can team fight better and play for the objectives more successfully than the enemies, you can overcome a significant golden XP deficit and still come out with a W. And a quick note, you may hear some people saying hyper late game, which I don't really class as its own game phase since a lot of games don't even go that long, but the hyper late game is typically when all players are level 20 with full item builds. Alright, so believe it or not, we're almost done. I'm just going to finish up this guide with a few smaller topics that are still very important but not significant enough to deserve their own main section of the guide. So first up we have rotations. The basic premise of rotating is very simple, moving from your lane to somewhere else looking to get an advantage from it. However, mastering rotations is something that even high level players have not done, myself included, and it's something that you're always working on. Some tips from my own experience I can give though are think about the opportunity cost versus the potential reward of a certain rotation. If you're a solo laner thinking about rotating to mid lane to pick up a kill on the enemy mid, you will likely lose a minion wave and maybe more such as the Totem of Ku, the Scorpion, your blue buff, etc. with no guaranteed reward. But if you do manage to pull off the kill on the enemy mid laner, that opens up the path for a potential Gold Fury play or Pyromancer, so the rotation could be worth it. Try to minimize the cost of rotating by doing it immediately after clearing a wave and or when you have no nearby jungle camps left to do, and try to maximize the gains of a rotation by doing it when you could gain an objective or when the enemy is out of position so you have a high chance of getting a kill, or by concealing your rotation so enemies don't see you coming, etc. Try to always learn from your rotations. If a rotation went well, why did it go well? Did you push the enemy back under tower before making the rotation so they couldn't follow you and you were a man up in the fight that ensued? Had you gained a large lead in your lane so you were way far ahead and made a big impact on the fight? Did you time a rotation really well to show up exactly on a Gold Fury spawn? And likewise with failed rotations, were you too far behind and you should have stayed farming instead, you didn't really make an impact on the the fight? Did you try to follow an enemy rotation but you were too slow? Were you not even needed in the first place? Sometimes you just didn't need to rotate. Rotations are one of those things that you can't teach with words, you need experience, but hopefully this short section has helped you with them. Moving on to ganks, this is sort of a subsection of rotations in a way, and it's equally mysterious as to how you should be successful with ganks. Ganking a lane means coming into that lane looking to get a kill on the enemy that is defending it. Junglers are the role that will gank the most, but that doesn't mean that other roles can't gank as well. A well-timed gank from a mid laner, support, or even solo or ADC can work wonders. I'll cover warding in more detail soon, but sentry wards are great for ganks, both for defending against them as you can see enemies coming, but also for attacking since you can clear enemy wards to make sure they have no vision, making them much easier to catch off guard. Make sure to always be checking the map for potential gank opportunities, especially if you're the jungler. So wards, everyone tells you to buy them, but why? Well, wards illuminate the map and allow you to see enemies you wouldn't otherwise be able to. As I just mentioned, this is a great tool to prevent ganks or at least see them coming in advance to give yourself a better chance of countering them. Wards, specifically sentry wards, are also extremely important around objectives. If you have no wards on a Gold Fury or Fire Giant, the enemy can try and sneak it away from you at any time, so make sure to gain vision of the area to have the advantage. Sentry wards allow you to see and destroy enemy wards, so if you have a sentry in the area, you can be sure that the enemy doesn't have any wards in that same area. Thus, if you have an objective sentry warded, you can try and take it with peace of mind that the enemy can't see your movements. You get free wards from the warding sigil in the early game, but be sure to buy the occasional ward extra for 50 gold from the store. When used correctly, they provide far more than 50 gold of benefit, but as the game goes later, you really want to be picking up mostly sentry wards to counter enemy vision. If you're curious where to ward, here's a few good spots I like to use in Season 8. Some are for tracking enemies as they move through the jungle, and some are for objectives. So invading in Smite has become a lot less prevalent in the last few seasons, but it's still worth to be aware of them. Invading means taking enemy jungle camps and is a very high risk but high reward strategy. If you take your own jungle buff, you gain the jungle buff, but if you take the enemy's jungle buff, you gained a buff and they lost a buff, so invades are worth double. Be careful if you're going to invade and try to ward up so you can see enemy movements and know if they're coming to punish you for an invade. A good time to invade is when you have the enemy on the back foot and you think you could win a fight with them if it came to that. If they don't contest your invade, you got a free jungle camp, but if they do contest your invade, you need to be ready to take a fight or at the very least have an escape path planned out to get away quickly. And finally, a bit on objective play in Conquest. I know I discussed the basics of objectives before, but it's extremely important to know how to play around these objectives since it's very different to standard teamfights and skirmishes. All 5 roles have a different part to play in gaining control of the objectives of Conquest. Typically, there will be one player tanking the hits at the objective. This is usually a tank, so solo laner or support, but sometimes ADCs with strong lifesteal can do this as well. You then have the damage dealers that pump damage into the objective. ADCs are the best for this as they have strong DPS that is not reliant on cooldowns since most of their damage comes from basic attacks, but the mid laner can also pump in some good damage as well. The mid laner though is usually the primary secure for the team. Objectives can be stolen by enemies once they get low, and so you need a big burst of damage to come in and secure the objective once it gets low on health. The mid laner is usually a mage, so they're great for this. If the enemy team are alive, you'll likely need a zoner, which creates space for your team and keeps the enemy away by crowd controlling and sometimes threatening to kill them if they come too close. The zoner can be any of the solo laner, support or jungler depending on who is occupied with other things. If the solo laner is tanking the objective and the jungler is pumping some damage in, you as the support may need to zone. But if your support is dead and the solo laner is tanking the objective, you as the jungler may need to zone. It really depends on what you need. The jungler's role is pretty much flexible. They can be a DPS, they can be a zoner, or they can even tank depending on the god and playstyle. But that's it for me for the complete Conquest guide for Season 8 Smite. If you enjoyed this one and found useful information in it, then be sure to leave a like and share the video around. We're early in the season and I'm sure there's lots of you and your friends or just new players in general that want a leg up in Conquest. If you're looking for a more in-depth look at the roles of Conquest, then be sure to subscribe as I will be doing my signature comprehensive role guides, which are each usually 20 minutes plus, going hardcore on what to do in each role at each stage of the game. But for now, that's all I got. Peace.